Hello there, travelers. And in this video, I'm going to explain the historical methods that I'm using in my videos. There are a hell lot of YouTubers who are also historians who really have their own niche market for their audience. But because my topics are usually about Jewish history and the history of Zionism in Israel, then the whole idea, the whole issue of my subject matter is very much contested. And there is a hell lot of aggravations and emotions and feelings surrounding the topic that I'm using because the content is still debated. The subject material is something very much in the blood and in the feelings of the people who are involved in it, mainly the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So it is very important for me to discuss the historical method that I use because there are a hell lot of histories out there, not only on YouTube and on TikTok. There are like thousands upon thousands of histories about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and Jewish history and Arab history and Muslim history and many other related topics. And therefore it is really important for me to state my historical approach in my videos. What exactly makes my videos more credible, better suited for thinking people? I don't know. So I want to do a little introduction about historical processes and historiography in general, and then about my own method of doing a historical research and my own points of interest. So mostly when people talk about historiography or modern historiography, they usually use the Elton Carr conflict, which is something most historians know. But I assume that the average YouTube viewer doesn't know, so I'll do a little of I'll repeat it and I'll explain it a bit more. So in 1961, scholar and historian E.H. Carr, Edward Hallett Carr, wrote a book called What is History? And in this book, Carr really explains that history is a dynamic between facts and interpretation. In his introductory chapter, he explains that a historian who only cites facts is not really a historian. I can say that, for example, in November 29th, the UN General Assembly really decided on Resolution 181, number 2, about the partition plan of mandatory Palestine, which will be a true fact. It's something that you can easily check and see that it is factually true. But just by saying that, I'm not really making any history, because history, according to Carr, is an interpretation. And I would like to cite from Carr so that you can see exactly what he means. So Carr says at the end of his first chapter that both the interpretation and the selection and ordering of facts undergo subtle and perhaps partly unconscious changes through the reciprocal action of one or the other. And this reciprocal action also involves reciprocity between present and past, since the historian is part of the present and the facts belong to the past. The historian and the facts of history are necessary to one another. The historian without his facts is rootless and futile. The facts without their historian are dead and meaningless. My first answer, therefore, to the question, what is history, is that it is a continuous process of interaction between the historian and his facts, an unending dialogue between present and past. So according to Carr, history is never or almost never just about the past. It is just as equally about the present. If I am a Palestinian or an pro-Israeli historian and I write about the partition plan of 1947, I'm not really interested in 1947. I'm more interested about the present. And this idea of history not as a search for the past but also as a search for understanding the present is something a bit that was contested later by another historian called Jeffrey Elton. Now, Jeffrey Elton published 6 years after Carr's What is History, published a book that is really a polemical against Carr's analysis of history. And according to Elton, history must be more about the facts of the past than an interpretation of the present. And I would also like to cite from Elton. So Elton says, "It is not the problems they study or the lessons they teach that distinguish the historical sheep from the goats, but only the manner of their study, the precision of their minds, and the degree to which they approximate to the ultimate standards of intellectual honesty and intellectual penetration. Omnia veritas." So a historian is not only telling a story about the past that is more a story about the present or his interpretation of the present. It is first and foremost looking at real facts or basic of facts, or let's call it a bed of facts, and he builds his history only based on these facts. He can't, for example, as he assumes Carr may have hinted, write a whole fictional story about the past based on very thinly spread facts that are not exactly facts, meaning that the purpose of the historian is first and foremost looking at the facts, validating the facts, finding as many facts as possible, and only then build the narrative, not coming from the narrative, from the story that is mostly about the present and use the past to really strengthen this story. But it is a very meticulous and sometimes boring job of looking at the facts and validating them. And most modern historians, especially after postmodernism really exploded as a philosophical agenda in the 70s and 80s, most scholars today lean more to what Carr said. For example, Hayden White, in his article, he is another historian who is also a literary critic who used his literary criticism really to write about history. In his article, Historical Emplotment and the Problem of Truth, published in 1992, he really summarized his views on history, and we can see that they are more in tune with Carr's ideas of history. So for example, he speaks about, can we really talk about Nazi Germany and the Holocaust? Can we really look at competing narrative to the Holocaust? So the Holocaust, let's say the narrative is that Jews were persecuted, and in the end many Jews, millions of Jews, were really killed in a genocidal killing spree of the Nazis in their intent to destroy the Jewish race. Is this narrative something that needs to be competed with? Something that needs to be replaced? Can we allow ourselves really to look at facts more carefully? I don't know. And we will look at facts about the Holocaust in later videos. I will talk extensively, I hope, about the Holocaust and the sources for it. But let's assume I find a whole lot of other sources that really refute this narrative, or at least diminishes it, or as White says, can make it look more as a farce and less a tragedy. Can we really look at this narrative? Can we really adopt this narrative? Can we really allow such a narrative? And according to White, no, but perhaps yes. White says that when you really refute a narrative or accept it, you only need to look at two things. First, you need to really approach this narrative. One, if it were presented as a literal rather than figurative representation of the events, meaning that it is written as something more factual. In 1942, the Nazis did that. In 1943, they did that. These are the sources that I use. It is used in a regular language about facts. Okay, it's factual and it's not figurative. It's not something that you use similes and metaphors as, let's say, a novel or something like that. So it must be not a novel. Okay, and the second thing, the plot type used to transform the facts into a specific kind of story were presented as inherent in rather than imposed upon the facts. So he says that your story must be something not artificial, but something that really holds water, something that the facts really support. For example, there was a study some 20, 30 years ago about Israeli soldiers and sexual violence. And the person who did this research she did it from, I think, the 60s to the present day of her, which was like 2000 or something. In these 40 years, she really wanted to find as many as rape stories or sexual violence stories that Palestinian women really reported against Israeli soldiers, and she wanted to analyze them statistically and otherwise. And she was pretty much bummed because she found none, or at least none that really held water. So this is the facts. Barely none or no Israeli soldiers sexually assaulted Palestinian women. Okay, what do I do with these facts? So many other scholars used her research to claim many things. One of them, for example, claimed that the reason why Israeli soldiers didn't sexually assault Palestinian women is because they are racist. They wouldn't touch an Arab woman. This is why they do that. So this is an example where you really take your narrative and you impose it on the facts, because as most Israelis know, and even in my discussion with students about it, with my 11th and 12th grade students, you can find out that a lot of Israelis don't find Arab women repulsive. They watch Maya Khalifa's porn, for example. Okay, so we see that this narrative, that in the case of the scholars that really used this woman's research, they imposed their narrative on the facts. So according to White, such a thing is something a historian must shun. Yes, you can stretch the facts. Yes, you can stretch your narrative, but if you can't stretch it too far. You can use your narratives to really be the source of your research, but you can't impose them. But in general, White does agree with Carr in that he says that the interpretation of the past according to your present narrative is the heart of the historical research that you do, not the basic boring facts of the archive. And in my approach to history, I don't exactly use Carr's approach. I'm more keen to look at Elton's more, let's call it, objective approach to history. That history is something that perhaps not all people would agree that a certain event really strengthens their narrative, but you can prove that a certain narrative is less valid, not invalid, but less valid from another narrative, at a certain point of time at least. So when I talk about my methods of historical research, I basically structure it into two. How I treat primary sources, which for the non-historian viewer I would explain that primary sources are historical leftovers from the period that you research. Let's say I want to know something about the time of Jesus in then the province of Judea. So I look at the historians who lived at the time, and there was only one really proper historian who lived at the time at the place, at the place of Jesus, which was Josephus Flavius. So looking at Josephus, I have a primary source here. So how do I treat this primary source? What are my methods for using primary sources in my historical analysis? And my method in using primary sources, first of all, is to be very skeptical about them. If you have a hell lot of primary sources, let's say I want to look at a certain event that happened a week ago and I have like thousands of witnesses and a lot of media really filming it at the time, and I have a lot of people involved in it who write it as it happens, then I can really have a lot of information that I can analyze. But sometimes I have only one, as in the case of Josephus Flavius. And in that case, I must be extremely skeptical. I need to look at motives. Every time I need to look at motives. But if I have less source material, less primary sources, I need to be even more skeptical. So this is something that I will always use in my historical research, being extremely skeptical and being a bit less skeptical when there are a hell lot of other sources, primary sources from the period that I really research. Another thing that I want from a primary source is that I will have as many as possible from different competing camps or groups. So let's say I would do a video about Israel's war of independence. So my primary sources would be also from Palestinian town archives, also from the Israeli army archives, also from the Arab army archives, which are, by the way, are not open to the public. So sometimes I'll have to just choose what I have. And British, American, French, other groups that really, at the time that the thing happened, were really here at the place of the happening, and they really made a history of it. They wrote what they saw. So analyzing this many different sources, you can get a more, let's call it a bed of facts that you can build upon your historical narrative. If you don't have enough primary sources, then your bed is a bit shaky and your story needs to be, let's say, taken with a grain of salt, maybe. Okay, so I always take it as part of my historical research that primary sources need to be as varied as possible, and they also need to be numerous. If they are not, then I need to judge according to what I have, but I know that my judgment may be wrong. Okay, so this is one thing about primary sources. Another final thing about primary sources is context. When I use a primary sources, I can't just cherry pick it. I can't say, oh, this really refutes my narrative that I came beforehand with, so I'm just going to ignore it. Another one, oh no, this is not exactly what I thought I would find, so let's just scrape it. Oh, here is one that says exactly what I want the narrative to say. Let's use it. Cherry picking primary sources is bad for me. I don't see it as something that a good historian should do. And the context is extremely important, because I'll give a small example. Many people in Israel today, ultra-Orthodox Jews and anti-Zionist Jews, they often use Herzl's, for example, Herzl's letter to the Baron Friedrich Leitenberger written in 1893, as a proof that Herzl himself, one of the main, or perhaps the main philosopher or ideologue of Zionism, is actually an anti-Semite, that Herzl was an anti-Semite. Now, reading Herzl's diary, which is his diary, and he published it, is not something that he hid. In 1893, from January to June, Herzl was broken. He really wanted the emancipation of the Jews and Jewish enlightenment and the incorporation of Jews in Europe to be complete. The Jews would be just a regular citizen in every state of Europe, and everything will be just perfect for the Jewish people. Persecution of Jews will just disappear. In 1893, he was broken because he saw with his own eyes that such a thing doesn't work, that Jews are still hated and persecuted no matter how much they integrate into European societies, and we'll talk about it lengthily. So for our example here, I would just say that in his letters, he was devastated. Also, his daughter was about to get born. So he really crazy thought, that Jews should really convert to Christianity. The Jews should leave Judaism. Perhaps this is the only way for Jews to escape persecution. He doesn't want his daughter to experience persecution. And he even sent letters, or wanted to send letters, to the Pope, in which he advised him, let me help you really convert the Jews to Christianity. He even said that anti-Semitism may be a good thing, because at least it leaves the Jews as a separate group, and they can really be aware of their persecution. So many people use this diary entry, 3 or 4 diary entries in the beginning of 1893, which is, by the way, before Herzl became a Zionist, as proof that Herzl was an anti-Semite and really an evil person which means that Zionism actually is a way for Christianity to control Jews, and it is a bad thing for Jews. Ultra-Orthodox Jews really like to use this, especially the extremists in them. They really want to use this narrative. But we need to put it in context. Herzl was broken at the time. It was before he became a Zionist. His life was a mess. And he is later, like 3 or 4 years later, when he becomes a Zionist, he really shuns it. He really says, oh, my idea was a terrible idea. It was a stupid idea. I'm ashamed of this idea. So saying that Herzl, the Zionist, 6 years later, is an anti-Semite, is taking Herzl's anecdote out of context. And this is something that me as a historian needs to really take out. I need to say, oh, let's look at it in context. The same thing also goes about the fight between, or the struggle between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Each look at the text, the Bible, or parts of the Bible, or an interpretation of the Bible out of context to prove that the other side is wrong. And when I talk about Judaism and the religion of Judaism, the Talmud, and all of these things in depth in later videos, I would always put things in context, the primary sources in context. It's super important. So this is my approach about primary sources. The second thing that I'm really need to take into account as a historian is secondary sources. Sometimes there are really good secondary sources with people who really have done the work for me. They read all the primary sources ever or possible, and they have a good control of the languages in which these primary sources were published, and they have their own judgment. So when I use a secondary sources, and I would use them a lot, and I would also do some reviews or criticism of certain of them. When I look at a secondary source, I need to look at the narrative. What is the narrative of this person? Perhaps he is so embedded in his narrative that his narrative really takes control of the facts. And in that case, I need to look at the primary sources that he used. and see whether he really used them, or the secondary other sources that he used, whether he used them correctly and professionally. For example, there is a very important political thinker called Norman Finkelstein. He became very popular now with his anti-Israel interviews in the media. And in his book, for example, Norman Finkelstein, this time we went too far, he really uses secondary sources and primary sources to prove a narrative. And his narrative is mostly that Israel is a very evil, warmongering state that only wants Arab blood on its hands. This is his narrative. And sometimes he takes primary sources out of context and he really mishmashed them together with his narrative. For example, he uses scholar Benny Morris. He uses Benny Morris' book, Israel's Border Wars, fought between 1949 and 1956 in the Sinai War, leading to the Sinai War. And in this book, Benny Morris, this is the Hebrew, the edited newer edition of the Hebrew version. He uses the English version, which is a bit outdated because archives were not opened until 1996, something like that. And then he opened the archives, Benny Morris, and he revised some of his ideas. But in general, Benny Morris' narrative, his own conclusion about the primary sources that he saw, is that Israel really acted because it felt threatened by Arabic propaganda and Fedaykin raids, terrorist raids against Israeli settlements in the 50s, the early 50s. And I will also have some videos about Israel border wars, and I will do a more thorough review of Benny Morris himself and this book specifically. So Finkelstein uses this book, or parts of it, especially the end, what Israel's purpose for the Sinai War was, really to say that Israel just wanted more territory. So it really decided to make the place worse, to make its relations with Egypt worse. She did raids into Gaza and into the Sinai, only to make the Egyptians angry so that a war would erupt and they could conquer Gaza. And he says that explicitly in the beginning of the book, page 16, he said, when Israel launched a bloody cross-border raid into Gaza, killing 40 Egyptians, Israeli leaders had plotted to lure Egypt into war in order to topple President Gamal Abdel Nasser, and the Gaza raid proved the perfect provocation as armed border clashes escalated. And then he uses Benny Morris' short anecdote about the Israeli retaliation after the Sinai War, in which they massacred some dozens or perhaps 150 Gazan citizens. And if you look at the context, and if you read Benny Morris, you see that most of them were probably not militias, but they were killed with a war with militias, so they weren't executed. It was part of a battle with militias inside Gaza, and many of them died. But the overall conclusion of Benny Morris is that Israel felt threatened, and it did it not because it wanted to take land, but because it feared that Egypt is going to conquer it soon. So it prepared itself at its borders. And when the border crisis was solved, Israel really left the border, or at least didn't really try to do more raids. So according to Finkelstein, if the purpose of Israel was just to provoke war with Egypt and conquer Gaza, why did they stop in 1957? Finkelstein explains it because they feared the United States. The United States really threatened them. But isn't that true? Now, in all of my research, in all of my discussions of secondary sources, I know that I also have a narrative. But I am not so dogmatic in my thinking as saying that Israel is a saint or that the Palestinians are evil or vice versa. There are a lot of gray areas in there, as in all narratives. And when I am dogmatic and fanatic about a narrative, then everything needs to serve that narrative. I would misuse secondary sources. I would say different claims when they actually says something else. They actually say something else. And this is something I really want to avoid when I use secondary sources. If I find a good, perfect or almost perfect or very, very fine, professional, as Elton says, a professional secondary source that really refutes my narrative, then I need to adjust my narrative. I won't really drop it together. And really, until the early 80s, Israeli historiography was really about a narrative that Israel is the perfect state and Zionism is the perfect movement and everything is only for Israel to prove to the world how good they are and how evil the world outside is. Fine. But then in the 1980s, a new group of Israeli historians called the New Historians, and I'll do a video about them too, really emerged. Now, some of them, like Benny Morris, they criticize Israel, but they don't go as far as to say everything Israel said. All of the Israeli archives are complete lies. All the facts that we have, all the documents that we have about certain events are false, and all what the Palestinians says and the anti-Israeli people said, oh, everything is true. They are the new saints and Israel is the new devil. So changing your ideas completely, like in a 180 degree, is something that I really don't want to do. If I find a perfect source that really disproves some of my ideas or narratives, then I'm modifying my narrative. I'm saying, okay, so it's not perfect, but look here, look there. I'm not cherry picking things. So when I use a secondary source, I'm willing to change my mind. And I'm going to do some reviews of very good secondary sources. Now, how can you really distinguish facts from lies? Now, my overall method is really to do a mixture between primary sources, and as I said, various from competing places, and the secondary sources to see different narratives and different judgments of the primary sources, and in the end coming to my own conclusion. And I'm more than willing to show in my videos the whole thought process that led me to really explain this narrative. So in every video that I make about history, I would start with providing primary sources, secondary sources. I would say, oh, here my narrative, this is my narrative, and my narrative is mostly based on this and that, and this and that. And I would show, and I would cite, and I would make it something that is not just a 10-second TikTok claim, which really sounds aesthetic and is cool, and here, I won. I'm like a Ben Shapiro or an Owens, or I don't know. My purpose here is not to make a debate or to really be witty or show someone that he really was defeated in my amazing rhetoric. My purpose here is to make a real researched, intellectual, less than emotional claims. And as you see, I'm in my workroom. My workroom is a mess. It has a lot of books, it has a lot of notes, it has a lot of things that are around me, because this is how the historical process is made. It's not a neat, aesthetic, just creation. It is something that needs a lot of work, a lot of thought, to put emotions aside, and it is a bit messy, sometimes boring, and it is time consuming. But I'm not afraid of these things, and I really hope that in my videos you would come to look at certain things that you are very emotional about, to look at them in a more intellectual, intelligent way. So I explained how I use primary sources and secondary sources in my videos. The last thing I just need to add is that my point of interest, my, let's call it specialité, which is not exactly a correct word, but never mind, is the history of ideas. While I would talk extensively about wars and political states and religion and other things, what really interests me is the development and change and diversity of ideas, how ideas are made. And this is what I made my PhD, by the way, about. It was about genres, how science fiction, horror, and fantasy really became separated from one another as being also connected as one big meta genre, but also as a different niche market for each and every one, and sometimes even a competing parts of the meta genre, how it was created. So the history of ideas is something that I'm really interested about. And I really hope that my videos would really make people less emotional about history, and it would make people less zombie-like when they see flags or stuff, just going and marching with them and shouting vehemently because they heard a very cool narrative. And they would learn how to judge narratives and how to criticize narratives and how to probe into narratives, including mine, hopefully mostly mine. So I hope this video was helpful in explaining you how my videos are made and what is their purpose. And I would see you on the next video.